There was a building at Highmarch that had not been opened in 7 winters. It stood at the north end of the park, past the yew walk and the frozen carp pond. A long block of pale stone, with a clock tower at its center, and a weather vane above that had rusted fast pointing east. It had been raised to hold 40 horses, and there was not a finer stable in the county, nor a colder one now. Its great double doors, twice the height of a man and banded in black iron, were shut and chained, and had gone green at the foot with moss. The gravel before them had furred over with grass, because no boot went that way, and no wheel turned there. In the mornings the frost lay on those doors longer than anywhere else on the estate, for the sun did not come round to that side of the yard until near noon, and by then the frost had had all night to settle its opinion. The district had a story about that block, and the district was very fond of it. They told it in the tap-room of the Fleece at Winstead, and at market, and to any traveller who asked why the great house on the hill kept its windows shuttered on the eastern front. They said that the Duke of Wykeham had burned his own stable down. They said he had been at the brandy, and had gone out at midnight to look at his horses as men do when the drink has made them sentimental, and had hung his lamp on a nail that would not hold it. They said the loft went up like a struck match. They said the yard lost horses that night, which had cost more than the church roof, and that a man was lost with them, and that another came out with a hand he would never open again. They said the Duke came out last of all, and that what came out was not entirely a face any more. And they said, lowering their voices as though the hill could hear them, that he had never sat a horse since. Not once, not in 7 winters, that an heir of one of the great riding families in England, a man who had been carried to hounds before he could sit a chair unaided, now went everywhere in a closed carriage with the blinds drawn, and that when the carriage passed a hunt in the lane he had the coachman turn and take the long way round. That much, at least, was true. The rest of it was not, but there was nobody at Highmarch inclined to say so. The Duke did not deny it. He had never denied it. When the coroner sat, he had answered every question put to him in 5 words or fewer, and offered nothing that was not asked. And when it was over, he had gone up to the house, and the chains had gone on the stable doors within the week, and he had not spoken of the fire aloud to any living creature since. The household learned the rules quickly, because there were only 2 of them. The first was that nobody went into the stable yard, not the gardeners, not the laundry maids taking the short way to the drying green, not the steward. The wall that ran round it was 10 feet of dressed stone, with a coping of flint, and the arch that let into it had a gate of oak on it now instead of the old iron scrollwork, and the gate was locked. The kitchen took the long road round to the ice house, which added 400 yards to every errand in every weather, and nobody complained, or nobody complained twice. The second rule was that nobody asked for the key. Mrs. Hurst, who had kept the house since before the fire, and would keep it until they carried her out of it, gave both rules to every new servant on their first morning, in a voice with no particular feeling in it at all, and always finished them the same way, more quietly. And don't go standing at the wall of an evening. Either. It's not a kind place to stand. Nobody ever asked her what she meant by that, which was probably as well because she would not have told them. But the servants did stand at the wall, now and then in 1s and 2s, at the hour when the light goes out of the sky and the rooks come home over the beeches. They stood on the path that ran along the outside of it, where a lime tree had grown up crooked against the stone, and they listened, and afterwards they said nothing to each other, and walked back to the house a little faster than they had come. There was also the matter of the water. At the north end of the block, where the wall came down to meet the paddock rail, there was a small door. It was a plain door, no more than a servant's door, half sunk below the level of the yard, with 3 worn steps going down to it. And it was not chained. It had a lock, and the lock was oiled, and there was one key to it in the world, and the man who carried that key was old Thomas Beck. Beck had been head of nothing for 7 winters. He was a bandy-legged old groom in a shrunken corduroy jacket, his right hand curled shut and shining with old scars, and he lived alone over the cart shed, and did the work of an odd job man, or would have if there had been anybody to make him. He kept 2 carriage horses in a lean-to-shed by the kitchen garden, and he kept them beautifully, and beyond that he did as he pleased, and nobody at Highmarch would have dreamed of telling him otherwise. And every evening at dusk, and every morning before light, Thomas Beck filled a pail at the pump, and carried it down the outside path, under the crooked lime, and went down the 3 worn steps at the north end, and unlocked the small door, and went in and shut it behind him. Nobody had ever asked him why. That was the shape of Highmarch when Clara Aldingham came to it, a great cold house on a hill with its heart bricked up, a man in it who would not be looked at, and beyond the yew walk a sealed block of stone that everyone in the county could describe in detail, and nobody in the county had seen the inside of. The county called it a ruin. The county was wrong about that too. It was not a ruin. It was a room with something living in it, and the door had been shut for 7 winters, and the man who shut it had shut himself in with it. 12 miles south of Highmarch, in the bottom of a green valley where the road crossed the Wyn by a hump-backed bridge, there was a yard that had been putting horses into the great houses of 3 counties for 60 years. It belonged to Edmund Aldingham, a heavy, weathered horsemaster with grey-streaked side whiskers, and a limp from an old fall, and it was not a grand place, a range of brick loose boxes round 3 sides of a square, a forge, and 8 fields of good old turf that had never been ploughed. What it had instead of grandeur was a reputation. If you bought a hunter from Aldingham, you bought a horse that had been handled every day of its life by people who did not shout, and you could put your maiden aunt on it in a fortnight. He had no fortune, because he had never once in 60 years sold a horse to a man he did not think fit to have it, and that is an expensive principle. What he had was the yard, and his name, and Clara. Clara Aldingham was his own, raised in that square of brick from the day she could walk across it. She was a slim, upright woman with chestnut hair bound in a plain braid, in a mud-hemmed riding habit of dark green wool, and she had a way of standing that people remarked on afterwards without being able to say what it was. She stood still. That was all it was. In a yard where everything else moved, the hands, the barrows, the horses swinging round in their boxes, the pigeons off the gutter, Clara Aldingham stood still, with her weight even, and her hands loose and her eyes on whatever she was looking at, and horses came to her the way rain comes down a window, without deciding to. Her father had taught her the whole of it in one sentence when she was very small, and she had never found anything to add. You do not go to the horse, he said. You make yourself a thing worth coming to. The ruin, when it came the way ruin usually does, which is slowly and then all at once and for a reason that had nothing to do with horses. Edmund Aldingham had put his name to a bond for a friend in the corn trade, because the friend had asked, and because he was the sort of man who says yes. The corn trade turned over. The friend went abroad. The bond stood, and the bond was for £1,140, and the paper made its way through 3 hands in 8 months, and one December morning a letter came from an attorney in Lincoln's Inn to say that the debt had been bought up entire, and was now held by His Grace the Duke of Wykeham, and that His Grace's man of business would be obliged by a settlement at Lady Day. Edmund read it twice, and put it in the fire, and then had to fish it out of the fire again with the tongs, because he needed the address. There was no settling it. The yard was worth the money, and a little over, but the yard was the money, and if it went there was nothing to make more with. He said so plainly at the kitchen table, with his hands flat on the board on either side of the letter, and said he would go up to Highmarch himself and ask for time, and expected he would not get it. Clara said, "I will go." He told her she would not. He told her that a man who buys up another man's paper in secret and sends an attorney to say so is not a man you send anybody to alone. He told her what the district said about the Duke of Wykeham, all of it, the lamp and the loft and the hand that would not open, and what it said about his face. Clara listened to the whole of it, standing still, and then she said, "You bred and broke a horse for him once, the grey." Her father stopped. He had, and she remembered it, because she had been the one who first got a hand on the colt's neck, standing in the middle of a wet April paddock for 3 days, running with her back half turned, until he came and put his nose against her shoulder of his own accord. A grey, dappled dark as a wet slate then, with a white star set high between the eyes, and a habit of coming to a voice rather than a hand. Wykeham had come down himself to see him ridden, before the fire, before any of it, and had stood on the rail for an hour and a half and asked 4 questions, and had paid the price Edmund named without a word of haggling, and had said one thing at the gate that Edmund had repeated at the supper table for a month afterwards. He had said, "I shall not want another." Nobody knew what had become of the grey. He would have been in the block that night. Everyone assumed the worst, and nobody had ever asked. "I will go," Clara said again. She rode up on the Tuesday, alone, 12 miles in a wind with sleet in it, and the gates at the bottom of the Highmarch drive were open, because nobody had shut them in years, and the drive ran 1.25 miles up between beeches with the rooks going over. The house came out of the trees all at once, and it was the coldest-looking house she had ever seen. Grey ashlar, 3 stories, an east front with every shutter closed, and not one chimney out of 11 making smoke. She was kept in the hall for 40 minutes. Then a footman took her along a passage to the library, and opened the door, and did not come in after her, and shut it. The library was almost dark. The curtains were drawn across all but one window, and against that one window, with the grey afternoon behind him, a man was standing with his back to the room. He was tall and broad in the shoulder, and he did not turn round. He said, "Your father owes me £1,140. Clara said, "He owes £1,140. He owes it to whoever holds the paper. This week, that is your grace." There was a pause of about 3 seconds, and in it she understood that he had not expected to be answered at all, and that nobody had spoken to him plainly in a very long time. He said, "What do you want?" "Time," she said. 5 years. 3, if you press me. The yard makes 90 to 120 a year clear when it is let alone. It cannot make 1100 by Lady Day, and it cannot make it by selling itself, because a set of empty boxes on a bad road is worth nothing without him in it, and every man in the county knows it. Another pause. He said, still to the window, "You are very well informed for somebody who came here to beg." "I did not come here to beg," said Clara. "I came here to explain the arithmetic. Begging is next, if the arithmetic fails." He turned his head then. Not far. Enough that she saw the line of his jaw against the window light and understood, in the half of a second before he checked himself and turned it away again, that the district had not exaggerated the fact of it, and had understood nothing else about it whatever. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Wykeham, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark riding coat, the right side of his jaw and throat drawn tight with old burn scars, kept half in shadow. He wore a glove on his right hand indoors. He stood always with his left side to a room, and he had arranged the furniture of his own library so that a person coming in would be obliged to sit where the light was behind him. He said, "Sit down, Miss Aldingham." She sat. He did not. He said, "I did not buy your father's bond to take his yacht. I bought it because Harrow and Slee were about to have it, and Harrow and Slee would have had the yard sold by February and your father in the fleet by March. I bought it to hold the water back. I have not sent to him for a shilling. The letter you had was written by an attorney who is paid to write letters, and I am obliged to you for coming, because I could not think of any way of saying that to him which he would have believed." Clara sat with her hands in her lap and did not move at all. She said, "Then why not say it?" He said, "Because a man who is told his debt has been bought by the Duke of Wykeham out of kindness does not believe it, and asks what is wanted, and there is nothing wanted, and then he spends the rest of his life waiting to be told. And because I do not receive, and because your father would have come here to see me, and I do not wish to be seen. Those are the reasons in order of importance, and the last is the true one." It was the first honest thing anybody had said to her about the man on the hill, and it had come out of the man himself, flatly, with his face turned to a window. She thought about it for some time. He let her. That too she noticed. Then she said, "There is a difficulty with your arrangement." He said, "There is. The difficulty was this," and they both saw it. A debt held quietly over a neighbor, never called, never forgiven, is not a mercy. It is a rope with no knot in it. Edmund Aldingham would go on rising at 4 in the morning with that letter in his head, and would be old in 2 years. "Forgive it outright, then," Clara said. He said, "I cannot. It is entailed with the rest, and my trustees would have it out of me at the next accounting, and they would be right. Money cannot leave this estate without a consideration got in writing, and it has to be worth £1,140 to Highmarch." "And what," said Clara, "is worth £1,140 to Highmarch?" He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "A duchess." She did not laugh, and she did not stand up, and she did not do any of the things he had evidently braced himself for, because his shoulders came down half an inch when she did none of them. he said, still to the window and faster now, as a man says a thing he has rehearsed and wants over. There is a settlement drawn already that my grandmother's will requires. If I marry, certain funds are released and certain debts of the estate may be discharged at my discretion. Your father's among them, at a stroke, in law, forever, and no trustee in England could say a word. You would have this house, your own rooms, your own income. You would not be required to keep my company. You would not be required to look at me. I would ask you for nothing else as long as I live, and your father would owe no man anything by Friday. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked 11 times before she answered, and she counted them. She said, "You are offering to buy me." He said, "I am offering an arrangement which happens to save a yard I admire. If you find that indistinguishable from the other thing, you are entitled to, and you may go home, and the bond will sit in my drawer untouched for as long as I am alive, and I will write to the attorney tonight and tell him to send no more letters." Clara Aldingham stood up. She walked, not to the door, but round the end of the table, so that she was standing on his left, in the light, where he could see her without turning his face into it. He went stiff as a gate. She said, "I will marry you, on 3 conditions." He said after a moment, "Name them." "The first," she said, "is that my father is told the truth of it. Not the arithmetic, the truth. That you bought the bond to stop Harrow and Slee before ever you set eyes on me. He will be told that by you, in this room, before the banns, or I do not come up the aisle." He inclined his head about an inch. "The second," said Clara, "is that I live here. Not in London, not at the Dower House, not in Bath with an allowance and a companion. Here in this house, where I can see the park." He said, "You will not like it." "I did not say I would like it," said Clara. "And the third?" "The third," she said, "is that you do not lie to me. Not ever, and not kindly. You may refuse to answer me as often as you please. You may say, 'That is not your affair,' and I will not press you. But you will not tell me a thing that is untrue in order to make me comfortable, because I would rather stand in the cold and know it than sit by a fire that is painted on the wall." There was a silence in that dark library that went on so long she could hear the rooks outside. Then the Duke of Wykeham said, very quietly, and for the first time turning far enough that she saw both his eyes, Miss Aldingham, "I accept your terms, and I will tell you now, at no charge, the first true thing, which is that I do not think you know what you are asking for." They were married 3 weeks later, at 8 in the morning, in the estate chapel at Highmarch, with the frost still on the graves outside. There were 4 people present, besides the parson, Edmund Aldingham, who had wept in the library and again in the trap, and would not be comforted, Mrs. Hurst, in black bombazine, who cried and denied it, a footman as second witness, and, at the very back by the door, with his hat in his ruined hand, old Thomas Beck, whom nobody had invited and nobody dared send away. The Duke stood on Clara's left throughout, which she understood. He put the ring on. His hand shook so badly he had to take hold of her fingers with his gloved right to steady the left, and when he did it he said, so low that only she heard it, "I beg your pardon," and she said so low that only he heard it, "There is nothing to pardon." There was no breakfast, and no bells rung, and by 9 o'clock the chapel was empty, and the trap was going back down the hill with her father in it, and Clara Aldingham, who was now the Duchess of Wykeham, stood on the gravel in front of the coldest house she had ever seen, and looked north past the yew walk, at a long roof of pale stone with a clock tower on it, and a weather vane rusted fast, pointing east. Mrs. Hurst gave her the 2 rules that same afternoon, in the passage outside the still-room, in exactly the voice she used on scullery maids, because she did not know any other voice for it, and was too honest to invent one. Any room in the house, your grace, any room you like, but not the stable yard, and don't ask me for the key, because I haven't got it. Clara said, "Who has it?" Mrs. Hurst looked at the floor and said that there were no keys to the great doors at all any more, that they were chained inside and out, and that the small door at the north end was Beck's affair and always had been, and would be, until Beck was carried up to the churchyard. "And what is Beck's affair?" said Clara. Mrs. Hurst said, "His Grace's, ma'am," and went to see about the linen. The rooms Clara was given were on the west front, warm and lately painted, which told her that somebody had been ordered to make them ready, and given a month to do it. On the mantel lay a pair of silver spurs of the useless ornamental sort, put there by some well-meaning housemaid, who had heard the new Duchess was a horsewoman. Clara looked at them a while and then put them in a drawer, because she had never in her life had the least use for them, and did not intend to begin. She moved the writing table herself, before dinner, without asking anybody, from the wall to the east window, and when she had done it she sat down in the chair behind it, and looked out. Past the shrubbery, past the yew walk, black and dripping, past the pale slab of the frozen carp pond, a long roof of grey slate, a clock tower with no hands on it, 40 yards of stone wall with a flint coping and one crooked lime tree grown up against it. That was the view she had asked for and been given, and she had asked for it on purpose. Dinner was at 7, in a dining room 40 feet long, at a table laid for 2, with 11 feet of mahogany between the places. He came in on the stroke, and sat at the end with the candles behind him, and his right side to the dark panelling. And for the first 4 evenings they got through the whole business on 9 sentences and the weather. On the 5th evening, Clara moved her place. She did it before he came in. She had the footman carry her cover down to the corner of the table, so that it sat at his left elbow. And she sat down there and waited with her hands in her lap. When he came in and saw it, he stopped short in the doorway, and the footman went the colour of the tablecloth, and there was a moment in which the whole evening could have gone the other way. Then the Duke of Wykeham walked the length of his own dining room and sat down, and said, "You are in a draught." Clara said, "I am from a yard. I have been in a drought since I could walk." He almost, but did not quite, laugh, and it was such a strange sound coming out of him that the footman had to leave the room. After that they talked, a little and then more. He was, when he could be got to speak at all, an educated and precise man with a dry turn that took her 3 weeks to be sure was there. He knew the estate to the last rod of ditch, and had never walked over half of it, because he did the whole thing on paper now, out of maps and rentals, sitting in the library with the curtains drawn like a man conducting an orchestra from another building. There were 2 subjects that closed him like a shutter, and she found them both in the first fortnight, and never once went at them by the front. One was the fire, the other was horses, not the word. He could say the word. He could discuss the price of oats and the merits of a neighbour's team, without a flicker. But if the talk came near a saddle, near hounds, near any question that had a man on a horse in it, he went absolutely still, answered in one clause, and then asked her something about the kitchen garden. Clara learned the house instead, thoroughly, in the way of a woman who has been given a house she did not want, and means to know every foot of it before she decides what she thinks. The long gallery with its 40 pictures under Holland covers, the chapel and the family in the floor of it, and the newest stone, which was his father's, cut 11 winters back. A bedroom on the second floor shut up with the furniture still in it, and a lady's workbox on the table, which she came out of quietly and did not go back to. And she found the wall. It ran 40 yards, 10 feet high, with a coping of flint set in mortar to turn a hand, and the arch into the yard had an oak gate with 3 iron straps and a lock the size of a prayer book. The crooked lime grew hard against the outside of it, on the path, and the path was the only place at Highmarch where the grass was worn, in a strip about 18 inches wide, going north. She walked it every day. In the first week she told herself it was for the exercise. On the 9th evening she stood under the lime at the hour when the rooks come home, with her hands in her sleeves and her breath going up white, and she listened and heard nothing at all for 11 minutes. And then, from a long way inside the stone, one flat knock. Hard on hard. Once Clara Aldingham had been in yards since before she could reach a bolt. She knew the sound of a shod hoof struck once against a stone floor by a horse that has heard something and is not sure yet whether to care. She did not move. She stood perfectly still under the crooked lime with the light going out of the sky, and after a very long time she said, not loudly, not to anybody, in the flat, easy voice her father used across a paddock well, "Good evening." There was no second knock. But there was, she was almost certain, a change in the quality of the silence on the other side of the wall, of the kind a room makes when something in it has lifted its head. She went back to the house and ate her dinner 11 feet from her husband, and said nothing whatever about it, and that night she lay awake until 2, with her eyes open in the dark, doing the arithmetic of it, which came out the same however she turned it round. 7 winters. A pail of water carried down twice a day, morning and evening, in all weathers, by an old man with one hand, who had never missed and never explained. You do not carry water to a ruin. She went to Beck the next morning, and she did it properly, which is to say she went to his work and not to his door. The lean-to by the kitchen garden held the 2 carriage horses, a pair of solid brown geldings with clean legs and a shine on them you could not buy, in a shed with a beaten earth floor swept in herringbone. Beck was doing the near one over with a wisp when she came in, working left-handed, holding the horse steady with the curled right forearm against its shoulder in a way he had plainly worked out for himself over a long time. Clara did not say good morning. She picked up the second wisp off the ledge, went to the far horse, and started at the top of the neck. They worked for 11 minutes without a word between them. Then Beck said to the horse, and not to her, "You've done that before." Clara said, "Every day until December." Another silence, longer. Beck said, "Aldingham's. Yes, the grey what come here. The star. Bred him, didn't you?" Clara's hand did not stop moving, because her hands had been trained a long time ago not to stop moving when something happened. She said, "My father bred him. I was the first up on him. He is a horse that comes to a voice." And old Thomas Beck stood up straight on the other side of a brown gelding, a bandy-legged old groom in a shrunken corduroy jacket, his right hand curled shut and shining with old scars, and looked at her for a good while, and his chin was not entirely steady. He said, "I ain't allowed to talk about it, Your Grace." Clara said, "I have not asked you anything." That evening she did not go and stand under the lime. She went instead to the corner where the paddock rail met the wall, well back out of the light, and waited in the cold, and at 5:10 old Beck came down the path from the pump, with a pail in his left hand, going slowly, spilling nothing, and went down the 3 worn steps at the north end, and put a key in the lock, and went in and shut the door behind him. She counted. He was inside for 22 minutes. When he came out, the pail was empty, and he stood on the top step for a moment, with his head tipped, listening back into the dark, the way you do when you are leaving something you would rather not leave. And then he locked the door and went away up the path, and never once looked over at where she was standing, which is how she knew he had known she was there the whole time. She let 3 more evenings go by. Then on the 4th, she went down to the small door after Beck had gone, and sat down on the top step with her back against the oak. She was aware, the Duchess of Wykeham, sitting on a cold stone step in the dark in a good gown. She said, in the flat, easy voice, "It is only me. I am not coming in." "Nothing," she said. "I know your name. You have a star up here, between the eyes, set high and a little off to the near side, and when you were 3, you would not stand for the farrier unless somebody sang, and it did not matter in the least what was sung, only that it went on. My father used to do a psalm, and the ostler used to do something we were all pretending not to know the words of. Nothing, but it was again a different sort of nothing. A room with something in it that is holding still is not the same as a room that is empty, and she had spent her whole life in that difference. She talked for 20 minutes about nothing at all, in a low, even voice with the pauses in it, and then she said good night and went in to dinner. She did it again the next evening, and the next, and the next. On the 6th evening there was a sound on the other side of the door, about 10 feet back, a shift of weight, the drag of a hoof through deep dry bedding, and then the long, unmistakable outbreath of a horse letting go of something it had been holding. Clara put her forehead back against the oak and shut her eyes, and found her face was wet, which surprised her considerably, because she was not much given to it. She said hello. It went on for 19 days. She learned the geography of it through an inch of door. That he was kept in the last box at the north end, nearest the small entry, because that was the end furthest from where the fire had been, and the only end old Beck could still get himself to. That Beck filled the manger from a hatch cut in the box door, and never went in. That somebody had been carting the soiled bedding out by night for 7 winters, and burying it in the shrubbery, which was why the shrubbery at the north end of Highmarch grew like the Garden of Eden, and nobody had ever been able to account for it. And she learned, by the 16th evening, that when she came down the path, he came to the front of the box, because she could hear it. 3 steps, a pause, 2 more, and then the settling. He was coming to a voice. After 7 winters in the dark, he was still coming to a voice. It was on the 19th evening that she found she was no longer content with a door, and that was the evening the Duke of Wykeham found her. She had not heard him come. He must have been standing on the path by the lime for some time. When she looked up, he was a tall shape against the last of the light with his hat in his hand, and she could not see his face at all, which she thought even then was probably a relief to him. He said, "Get up." Clara got up and shook out her skirts and did not apologize. He said, and his voice had a crack down the middle of it she had not heard before, "You were told. It was the one thing in the whole of this house you were told." "I was told not to go into the yard," said Clara. "I have not been into the yard. I have been sitting on a step." "Do not," he said, and stopped, and started again. "Do not be clever with me about this. Not about this." And Clara Aldingham said quite gently, with her hand still flat against the oak behind her, "He is alive." The Duke did not answer. She said, "I am not asking. I have heard him move, and I have heard him drink, and I have heard him come to the front of the box when I come down the path. He is alive, and he has been alive in there for 7 winters, and the whole county thinks he was lost with the others, and you have let them think it." There was a wind getting up in the yews, and the rooks were still going over, and the light was nearly gone. The Duke of Wykeham said, at last, in a voice like a man reading his own sentence, "Yes." They walked back up to the house together, not speaking, and he did not offer his arm, and she did not take it. And in the hall he said, "Come into the library," and she went. He did not draw the curtains this time. He stood at the fire with his left side to her, and he talked to the coals, and it came out of him in pieces, the way a thing comes out that has been packed in dry for 7 winters. "His name is Orion," he said. "He is 19. Your father sold him to me, and I have never in my life been so pleased with anything I bought." Clara said nothing. "He came out of the block," said the Duke. "He came out of it. He is marked from the point of the near shoulder up the neck to behind the ear. It healed years ago, and it healed hard, and there is nothing left in it now but the seams of it. And he is as sound in his legs as the day he was foaled, and he could carry me over anything in this county tomorrow. Do you understand me? There is nothing wrong with him." He said it too loudly, and the room took it and gave it back, and he stopped. "Then what is the matter?" said Clara. "He would not have a man near him," said the Duke. "Not afterwards. He was 3 weeks in the paddock, and then he began to be handled again, and he would not have it. Not from the vet, not from the farrier, not from me. He went over the rail twice. He put a stud groom through the door of the crush, and the man was 6 weeks laid up, and that was the last time anybody tried. And the county was telling its tale by then. And there were men in it who said what such an animal ought to be done with, and would have said it to my face if they had dared. And so," said Clara, "and so I put him where they could not get at him," said the Duke, "and I shut the door. He was going to be humane about it," he said. "It was to be a month. It was to be until he settled. Beck had the only key, and Beck went in twice a day, and Beck said, 'Leave him be, he's quiet in there, he's quiet in the dark.' And he was, and every month it was another month, and I did not go and look. And then it was a year, and then it was not something a man could undo by walking down a path, and I have not put my hand on that horse since the night I brought him out." He stopped. He said, 7 winters, twice a day. That old man has carried a pail down that path in every weather there is, with one hand, and never asked me for a shilling, and never once said a word to me about it, except to tell me he was quiet. And I have let him." Clara said, "Why did you not go?" and here he turned, all the way, so that the firelight went straight up the right side of his face, and there was no shadow anywhere to put it in, and he said, "Because he looks at me." She waited. "Because I brought him out," said the Duke of Wykeham, "and I did not bring the others, and every time I look at that horse I am standing in that yard again at 4 in the morning, with everything I had failed to do behind me, and he is looking at me with my own coat over his head, and I have not the courage. There it is. Say it plainly, and it is a small thing. A man has not the courage to walk 40 yards and look at a horse. It has taken me 7 winters, and I have not done it yet." The fire fell in on itself, and neither of them moved. Then Clara Aldingham said, "I will do it." He said, "No." She said, "You said I might have anything in this house." He said, "Not that. He is 19, and he has been in the dark 7 winters, and he put a grown man through a door. I will not have it. I would sooner be in my grave than be the reason you were carried up that path." Clara said, "Then come and hold the lantern." That stopped him entirely. She said, "I am not going to walk in there tomorrow and put a hand on him. That is not how it is done, and you know it is not. I have been sitting on a step. In a fortnight I shall be sitting on a step with the door open. In a month I shall be sitting inside the door with a lantern turned to the wall. He will come to me when he wants to and not before, and if he never wants to, then he never wants to, and I shall sit there anyway, because there is a living creature in that building who has heard nothing but one old man's boots for 7 winters, and I am not able to leave that alone. If you want a wife who can, you have bought the wrong one." The Duke stood in front of his own fire with his hands at his sides and looked at her, and after a long while he said, in a voice she had to lean in to hear, "What do you want from me?" "3 things," said Clara. He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. "Of course," he said. "Name them." "The first is Beck. He is to be told by you that he has leave to speak of it to me, and that he has always had leave, and that you knew. Yes, the second is the key. Not the great doors, the small one. I want my own, and I want it on my own ring, and I do not want to have to ask an old man to let me into my own husband's stable every evening of my life." He said, "Yes." "And the third," said Clara. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said it. "The third is that you come as far as the lime tree. Not the door, not the yard, the tree. On the path, where you have stood 100 times in the dark and thought nobody knew, because Beck knows, and I know, and there is a place on that path where the grass has been worn down by 2 men and not 1. You stand there while I am in with him. Every evening. You do not have to say anything, and you do not have to look at anything. Because a thing done 40 yards from a man is not the same as a thing done 12 miles from him, and because 7 winters is long enough, your grace, for both of you." He did not answer for so long that she thought she had lost the whole of it. Then he said, "Every evening." "Every evening," said Clara, and the Duke of Wykeham said, "Very well." The key came up on a tray at breakfast, on a saucer, like a sugar lump, and Clara put it on her own ring in front of the footman and said thank you, and went on with her toast. The work took 41 days, and it was the least dramatic thing that has ever happened at Highmarch. For the first 6 evenings she sat on the top step, with the small door standing open behind her, and did not go in, and did not look round. It was hard, because the smell of the place came out at her, cold stone, old straw, harness leather gone stiff, and under all of it the sweetish burnt timber smell that never quite leaves a building that has had a fire in it. She sat with her back to the dark and her face to the paddock rail and talked, and behind her at some distance she could not judge, something stood and listened. On the 7th evening she went in, 3 steps, and sat down on an upturned pail inside the door, with a horn lantern on the floor beside her turned to the wall, so that all it lit was a patch of whitewash and a bit of the flags. She had come in with no rope, no head collar, nothing in her hands at all, because a horse who has been handled by frightened men can read a hand from 30 feet in the dark. That was the first evening she saw him. The aisle ran off south into blackness under a barrel roof wide enough for 2 carriages, with the boxes in a range down either side and their doors standing open on emptiness all the way. The far end, 60 yards off, was boarded over with new deal that had gone grey. And at the near end, in the last box on the left, with the top door standing open and his head over the sill, there was a horse. He was a big dappled grey, gone almost white, 16 hands and 3, standing square, with the high white star between the eyes set a little off to the near side. He was in condition which nearly undid her, because it meant that an old man with one hand had been feeding him properly and doing him over through a hatch for 7 winters, and nobody in England had ever thanked him for it. Down the near side of his neck and up over the point of the shoulder ran a broad pale seam, where the coat came in white and grew the wrong way, healed years since, hard and clean. The way an old mark healed well will stay on a grey and go silver with him until it is only another dapple among the rest. His ears were forward. He was looking straight at her. Clara Aldingham sat on an upturned pail inside the door of a building nobody had opened in 7 winters, with her hands loose in her lap, and said, in a perfectly level voice, "There you are." And Orion put his head down over the door-sill and blew and did not go away. She came every evening at the same hour, and she was always the one who went, and she never once was the one who came. She sat closer by a foot a week. She took to reading aloud, because the words did not matter and the going on did, and so a considerable amount of Cowper and a great deal of the Farmer's Magazine, and on one absurd evening, the entire list of patrons of a Norwich charity was read out in the dark to a grey horse who listened to every word of it. And every evening, 40 yards away and outside the wall, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark riding coat stood under a crooked lime tree with his hat in his hands, from the hour she went down until the hour she came up, in rain and in frost, and once in snow that lay an inch on his shoulders, and did not once come nearer, and did not once go away. They did not talk about it at dinner. They talked about everything else. Beck talked, though. Beck talked a great deal. Once he had been told he might, and once he had got over being told, which took him the better part of an afternoon in the lean-to with his back to her. It was Beck who told her that the block had been built by the Duke's grandfather, and had held 31 horses on the night of the fire, and that the old man had run the place on a book, a great ruled day book kept on a shelf in the tack room at the north end, in which every order given in that yard was written down and signed off by the man who did it, because a yard where nothing is written down is a yard where nothing is anybody's fault. "Is it still there?" said Clara. Beck said, "Everything's still there, Your Grace. Nobody's touched nothing." and it was Beck who told her, on a wet Thursday, holding a hoof between his knees and not looking up, what the district had never once been told: that the new hay had come in green that August, that it had been stacked in the top loft over the north range because the south loft was full, that the head groom, a big, capable driving man named Harker, who had been 15 years in that yard, had been given an order in the last week of September, and that the order had been written in the book in his Grace's own hand: turn and draw the new hay, top loft, before Michaelmas, and that it had not been done. Beck said, I'd not say a word against Harker. He'd a family down the village, and he were a good man, and he were busy. And every man in this county has left a job a fortnight, and thought nothing of it. But green hay in a close loft goes hot. It goes hot in the middle where you can't feel it, and it goes on getting hotter. And there ain't no lamp and no spark and no drink in it at all. It fires itself. I've seen a rick do it in a wet October, and no man within a mile. He put the hoof down. He said, there weren't no lamp on no nail. There weren't never a lamp. His Grace were in his bed at the far end of the house, and I were the first man in that yard, and I know what I smelled, and I know where it come from, and it come down out of the top loft over the north range where the new hay were stacked. At 2:30 in the morning, Clara said very carefully, then why does the county say what it says? And old Thomas Beck straightened up with his ruined hand against the horse's shoulder and said, because his Grace let him, ma'am, because Harker were lost that night. And because his Grace stood up at that inquest with his face all fresh on him, and were asked, plain, as I'm stood here, whether the fire were owing to any neglect in his yard. And he said yes. And they never asked him whose. On the 41st evening, Clara walked down the aisle. She did it because it was time, and because Orion had been watching her come and go for a fortnight, with the flat, unbothered look of a horse waiting for somebody to get on with it. She took the lantern, uncovered now, and went slowly, and went past him, which was the point, past the box, down the aisle, 60 yards into a building sealed for 7 winters, so that he could see her go away and come back, and see that going away and coming back was a thing that happened in the world again. The lantern light went up the barrel roof and found the shape of it all. 31 boxes, with their doors open and their mangers empty, and their names on brass plates above them, every plate still bright because Beck had never been able to stop himself. A pump in the middle of the aisle with the handle up, the clock tower stair, cobwebs in ropes, and at the north end past the corn bin, the tack room. It was exactly as Beck had said. Nobody had touched anything. 16 saddles on their trees under a fur of dust, the leather gone the color of tea and dry as paper. A wall of bridles, a press with the estate colors folded in it, a cold grate with the ashes of a fire from 7 winters ago still lying in it, and a chair pushed back from the table, as though a man had got up in a hurry, which a man had, and on the shelf a great ruled day book with a strap round it. Clara set the lantern on the table and undid the strap and turned the pages, and the dust came off them and hung in the light. She found it in less than a minute, because it was the last full page. The last week of September, in a firm sloping hand, turn and draw the new hay, top loft north range, before Michaelmas, J.A.W., and beside it, in the column ruled for it, where every other line on every other page for 11 years carried a set of initials and a date to say the thing was done, there was nothing. A blank, half an inch of white paper with a fold of dust in it, and on the next line 4 days later, in the same firm sloping hand, and heavier, as though the pen had been pressed, hay top loft, second order. To be done this week, without fail. J.A.W. blank. She was still standing there, with her hand flat on the page, when she heard the boots in the aisle. She did not turn round at once. She listened to them come, and she heard them stop, and start, and stop again, and she understood exactly what she was hearing, and afterwards she thought it was the worst thing she had ever had to stand still and listen to. The Duke of Wykeham came the length of his own stable block for the first time in 7 winters, and it took him 5 minutes and a half to walk 60 yards. He came into the tack room doorway and stood in it, breathing as if he had been running, and looked at the room, and at the chair pushed back from the table, and then at his wife with her hand on the book, and he said, "I told myself for 4 years that I had never written it twice." Clara said nothing. He said, "I knew I had written it once. A man may write a thing once, and let it go, and think no more about it, and share the fault with the man he wrote it to. Twice is different. Twice is a master who knew," she said. "Twice is a master who was right." And then the Duke of Wykeham came into the tack room and sat down in the chair that had been pushed back 7 winters ago, and put his face in his hands, and told her the whole of it, and it took an hour, and the lantern burned low while he did it. He had woken to the smell, not the noise, and come out of the house in his shirt with light already in the top loft windows at the north range. Beck had been in the yard before him. Between them they got the near range open, and the horses out into the paddock. And then the men came running from the cottages, and they got more, and for a while it looked as though they would have them all. Then the loft floor over the north range gave, and the whole middle of the building went, and it was over. 9 were not got out. He said that plainly once, and did not describe it, and she did not ask him to, and he never in his life spoke of it again. Parker had gone in at the south end at the beginning, before the floor went, and had not come out, and when it was done, and the men were standing back because there was nothing else to be done, somebody said that Beck was not in the yard. He had been in the tack passage, working along the boxes on the west side, and a door beam had come down across the passage behind him and pinned him at the wrist against the frame. "I went in for him," said the Duke. That is where this came from. He put his gloved right hand up and touched, without seeming to know he did it, the drawn seam of his own jaw and throat. There was a beam, and I got it up, and he came out from under it, and we came out together. And I have his hand on my conscience, because I was 6 minutes getting to him, and 6 minutes is a long time. That is one man. That is the whole account of the good I did that night. One man. And his hand ruined, and I was too slow. Clara said, "And Orion." The Duke was quiet. Then he said, "He was in the last box at the north end." That end was still standing. I had come out with Beck, and they had hold of me, and I could hear him, and I knew that box, and I knew there was 30 feet of aisle between it and the small door, and I went back in, and I put my coat over his head, and I brought him out. He looked at the floor. He said they tell the story with a lamp in it because a lamp is a thing a man does. But that is not what they cannot forgive me for. They cannot forgive me for the one I brought out. 9 gone, and Harker gone, and the Duke of Wykeham comes out of the fire with his own grey. His own particular horse. the one he liked. That is what they saw, and that is what they have never let go of. And the terrible part, Clara, the part I cannot get round at 4 in the morning, is that I do not know that they are wrong. I do not know that I went back for him because he was nearest the door. I have never once been sure. And Clara Aldingham said, "Then let us go and ask him." They walked back up the aisle together with the lantern between them, and stopped 6 feet short of the last box on the left. Orion had his head over the sill. He had been watching the whole length of the aisle for an hour. Clara stood still, which was all she ever did, and the Duke of Wykeham stood beside her with his hat in his hands and did not move at all. The horse looked at him for a long moment with his ears going, and then he stretched his neck out over the door right out as far as it would go, and blew once hard in the man's face. It was not forgiveness, because horses do not deal in it. It was recognition, which is better, being a thing that has to be earned twice. The Duke put out his left hand about 8 inches and stopped, and did not close the distance, and stood there with his hand out and his eyes shut and his breath going quick and shallow. And Clara Aldingham had the sense to look at the floor and say nothing whatever for 2 full minutes. Then she said, quietly, "Tomorrow." And he said, "Tomorrow." It was Clara who touched him first, and she did it 8 days later, and it was not planned. She had taken to sitting on the flags outside the box, with the door open, reading, and Orion had taken to standing over her, which is a considerable compliment from a horse, and a considerable weight of him to have in the dark. On the 8th evening she reached up without thinking to move a fold of her shawl, and the grey put his head down under her hand, and her palm came down flat on the pale seam that ran up his neck to behind the ear. It was smooth. That was what undid her. 7 winters of a whole county saying the word ruined, and under her hand the mark was smooth and warm and hard as a saddle flap, an old thing long finished with, and beneath it the great muscle of his neck moved as he breathed, entirely sound, entirely alive, waiting for her to get on with the scratching. She said out loud to nobody, "Oh, you great fool, there's nothing wrong with you at all." And 40 yards away outside the wall, under a crooked lime tree, a man who had not heard her, but had heard the change in her voice, went down onto the wet path with his back against the trunk, and stayed there. After that it went quickly, the way it does when the thing was never the difficulty in the first place. The head collar went on in a week. He led out through the small door and up the 3 worn steps, and into the walled yard on the 3rd of March at 7 in the morning, in a white frost, with old Thomas Beck standing at the pump crying openly and not troubling to hide it, and the Duke of Wykeham standing in the arch of the gate, because that was as far as he had got by then. Orion came out into the light for the first time in 7 winters, and looked at the sky and did the only reasonable thing, which was to go straight up on his hind legs like a horse in a picture, and come down and shake himself from ears to tail so hard that the frost came off the cobbles. Then he put his head down and began to eat the grass growing between the stones, and that was that. They kept it to the walled yard for a fortnight, then the paddock, then the park. He was stiff for 4 days, and after that he was not stiff at all, and by the end of the month he was going round the park at a trot beside Clara's shoulder, on a slack rope with his tail up, a great dappled grey, gone almost white, 16 hands and 3, with a silver seam down his neck that you had to know was there to see. And of course the county found out. It found out because a grey horse the size of a garden wall going round a park in the sun is not a thing that can be kept quiet. The carrier saw him on the Tuesday. By Saturday it was in the Fleece at Winstead, and by the following market day there was a version in which the Duke of Wykeham had kept a maddened animal chained in the dark for 7 years, for his own reasons, which were not stated, but were understood to be very bad indeed. The man who put it about was called Crail. He was a dealer, a big, affable, florid man with a good coat and a bad yard 11 miles off, and he had done extremely well out of the fire. He had bought 4 horses off the estate within the month, at his own price, from a man who could not bear to look at them, and sold them on at Newmarket for a figure that had built him a new range of boxes. He had been telling the lamp on a nail story for 7 winters, in taprooms and at fairs, and to anybody who asked him where he had got such a good sort, and it had never cost him anything, and it had made him a great deal. He came up the drive on a Thursday in May with 2 other gentlemen, and a great deal of goodwill, on the business of a subscription for the hunt, drank the Duke's Madeira, and got round to it in about 11 minutes. There was a rumour, he said, and he was sure there was nothing in it. But a man had a duty to speak plain. A rumour that the grey was alive, that it had been shut up all these years because it was not safe. And if that were so, and he was sure it was not, then there were farms on that road and a footpath through that park, and the county would want to be satisfied. That was all. Only satisfied. The Duke of Wykeham did not answer. He had sat down with his right side to the shuttered window, out of 7 winters of habit, and Crail had spent 11 minutes talking to a shadow, and enjoying it. It was Clara who said, "Satisfied by whom, Mr. Crail?" And Crail, who had never in his life had to look at a duchess sitting bolt upright in a mud-hemmed riding habit in a drawing-room, said that he was sure the gentlemen present were as good judges of a horse as any in the county. "Then let us go down," said Clara, and stood up. They went down through the yew walk, 5 of them, on a bright May afternoon, and Mrs. Hurst watched them go from the still-room window and sent for Beck without being asked, because she had kept that house 30 years and knew a reckoning when she saw one crossing the lawn. At the arch the Duke of Wykeham stopped, and the others stopped with him. He said, "Not the gate." He walked on round the outside of the wall, past the crooked lime, to the front of the block, where the great double doors stood twice the height of a man in their frame of black iron, chained and mossed and green at the foot, with the grass grown up over the gravel in front of them. Beck was already there with a crowbar and a hammer and a face like a church. The Duke took off his coat. He hung it on the paddock rail in front of 3 gentlemen of the county, and rolled his sleeves to the elbow, which put the whole of his right forearm in the sun, and there was a considerable silence from the subscription committee. Then he took the crowbar out of an old man's left hand and set it in the staple and put his shoulder into it. And the staple came out of 7 winters of oak with a crack that went round the whole park, and the chain came down in a heap and lay in the grass. He put both hands flat on the doors. They had not moved since the week of the fire. They moved now an inch and stuck, and he leaned, and Beck leaned with his good shoulder, and Clara put her hands beside her husband's, and the left leaf came round in a long grinding arc, and stood open. And the afternoon went into that building for the first time in 7 winters. It went up the barrel roof and down 60 yards of aisle, and found every brass nameplate that Thomas Beck had gone on polishing in the dark, and the dust came up off the flags in a slow gold column all the way to the boarded end, and nobody said anything at all. Not the gentleman, and not the dealer, and not the Duke, and one of the gentlemen took his hat off, which he could not afterwards explain. Then Clara went in and fetched the horse. She brought him out on a slack rope in a head collar, and she did not lead him up to anybody, and she did not stand him for inspection. She turned him loose in the walled yard and stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides, and Orion went round her twice at a canter with his tail up and his ears going. 16 hands and 3 of him sound as a bell, and then came in and stood at her shoulder with his nose against her sleeve and stayed there. She walked to the mounting block. She got up on him with nothing on him but the head collar and the rope, and rode him round the yard 3 times, and stopped him square in front of Mr. Crail, and put her hand flat on the pale seam of his neck. She said, "Is the county satisfied?" Mr. Crail said, in a voice with a good deal less of the county in it than it had had in the drawing-room, that he was very glad to see it, and that of course there had never been anything in the rumour, and that a fine old horse well kept was a credit to any yard. Beck said, "Ask him about his hand." Everybody turned. Old Thomas Beck stood at the head of the great open doors, a bandy-legged old groom in a shrunken corduroy jacket, his right hand curled shut and shining with old scars, and he held it up so that all of them could see it, and he was not steady on his legs, but he was perfectly steady in his voice. He said, "I were pinned in the tack passage under a door-beam at 1:30 of a morning 7 winter back, and there weren't a man in that yard would come down it, and I'd not have blamed one of 'em. And his Grace come down it, and his Grace got that beam up off my arm with his own back and his own hands, and he took what he took doing it, and he carried me out, and he never once in 7 year let me say so, and I'm saying it now in front of gentlemen, and he can turn me off for it in the morning." Nobody moved, and then he said, "And the grey were the last thing out of that building, and his Grace fetched him with his own coat over the horse's head, and there weren't nobody holding a lamp for him neither. Mr. Crail said something about the hour and his gig. The Duke of Wykeham said, 'A moment, Mr. Crail.' He said it quietly, and Crail stopped, as if he had been taken by the collar. The Duke said, 'You bought 4 horses off this estate within the month, Chestnut Mare, the 2 Browns, and the bay by Grandison. What did you give me for them?' The florid gentleman had gone a curious colour. The Duke said, 'You need not answer. Mr. Pardoe here will remember what the bay made at Newmarket in the October, because he stood at the ring and told me of it in a letter meant kindly. I have never grudged you a penny of it. I was not in a state to sell, and you were good enough to relieve me, and that is trade. But I will ask you to consider. When next you tell the tale of the lamp on the nail in the Fleece at Winstead, that you have had a new range of boxes out of it, and I have had 7 years of it, and my wife has had to hear it in her own drawing-room." Crail went. The gig went down the drive faster than it had come up it, and Mr. Pardoe, who was 60 and had hunted with the Duke's father, stood in the open doorway of the block looking down 60 yards of gold dust, and said, "Wykeham, what began it then?" And the Duke of Wykeham said, "The hay." That was all he said. He did not say green. He did not say top loft north range. He did not say that there was a day book on a shelf 11 feet from where they stood, with an order written twice in his own hand and a blank column beside it. or that a big, capable driving man named Harker had a family living rent-free in the second cottage on the Winstead Road at the estate's charge, and had done for 7 winters, and would go on doing so, and that not one of them had ever been told why. He said the hay. It was my yard, Pardo, and my roof, and my hay. I'll say no more than that. Clara, sitting up on a grey horse in the middle of the walled yard, said nothing either, then or ever, and that was the only secret she ever kept from her father in her life, and she never once regretted it. The doors were never shut again. They took the boards off the south end in June, and found the roof timbers sound for 40 of the 60 yards, and by August there were masons on the burnt gable, and a smell of lime wash all down the aisle, and Mrs. Hurst had every window in the block out on the grass, and the maids at them, with vinegar. Edmund Aldingham came up on the first Sunday in June, in his good coat, and was met at the arch by his own family, and walked into the walled yard and stopped, and had to put his hand on the pump. He said, "That's my horse." He was in there an hour and a half. When he came out, the Duke of Wykeham was standing under the crooked lime, with his hat in his hands, because he had not yet worked out how to be in a yard with another man in daylight, and Clara's father, a heavy, weathered horse-master, with grey, streaked side whiskers, and a limp from an old fall, walked straight up to him and looked at him for a long moment, at the whole of him, at the drawn seam of his jaw and his throat in the plain sun, without hurry and without any pretence of not looking. Then he said, "You brought him out." The Duke said yes, and Edmund Aldingham said, "Then we'll say no more about £1,140, your grace, for I'd have paid it twice over, and I've nothing like the money." They walked down to the paddock together, and stood on the rail for an hour and a half more, and Clara watched them out of the tack-room window with a duster in her hand, and did not go down, because there are conversations a woman does well to stay out of, and most of them are about horses. It was the 9th of September before he rode. Beck had the saddle out of the tack-room in July, and worked on it for 11 days with his one hand, and it came up like new, and it sat on its tree in the aisle in the light, with nobody saying anything about it, for 7 weeks. On the 9th of September, the Duke of Wykeham came down to the yard at 6 in the morning, and said, to nobody in particular, "Put it on him." Then he said to Clara, "Go up to the house." She said, "No." He said, "Clara." And she said, "I will go where you went. I will stand under the lime, on the path on the other side of the wall, where you cannot see me and I cannot see you, and I will stand there the whole time, and you may take as long as you like. And if you cannot do it today, we shall come down again tomorrow, and I shall stand there again. 40 yards. It is what you gave me for 41 evenings, and never once asked me for anything back." He did not argue. He put his hand against her cheek for a moment, gloved, which was the most he had ever done, and then he went in through the arch, and Beck and Clara went out and shut the gate, and walked round the outside of the wall, and stood together under the crooked lime in the wet grass. They were there 25 minutes. They heard the horse walk. They heard him stop. They heard nothing for a long time. They heard the leathers creak once and stop, and then nothing again longer. Beck stood with his hat off, and his ruined hand against the stone, and his lips going. And then they heard a horse walk on cobbles, with a man on his back, which is not the same sound, and anybody who has stood in a yard knows It is not the same sound. And then they heard it go up into a trot, and go round and round again, and Clara Aldingham put both her hands flat against 40 yards of cold stone wall, and leaned her forehead on it, and laughed until she had to stop and get her breath. The gate came open behind them. He came out of the arch on a great dappled grey, gone almost white, 16 hands and 3, with the sun coming up over the beeches behind them both, and he was crying so hard he could not see, and he did not put a hand up to his face, and he did not turn his head away, and that was the first morning in 7 winters that the Duke of Wykeham let anybody at all look at him in full daylight, and did not care. He rode down the park. He was gone 40 minutes. When he came back, he came in over the ha-ha at a canter, and jumped it, which Beck said afterwards took 10 years off him and put 20 on Clara. That autumn there were 4 horses in the block, and by the spring after there were 11, and a foal out of the chestnut mare that Crail had sold back at a loss, and pretended he had not. Edmund Aldingham gave up the yard in the valley, and came up to Highmarch as stud master, and lived over the tack room, and was never once seen inside the house before dark. Old Thomas Beck was made head of the yard, and did nothing whatever with his own hands after that but polish nameplates, and told every new groom in the place the story of the beam, whether they wanted it or not, until the last day of a very long life. The clock tower got its hands back in October. The weather vane was freed with a ladder and a great deal of oil, and went round easily for the rest of its days. And somewhere in the middle of all that, without either of them being able afterwards to name the week, Clara Aldingham stopped walking on her husband's left. She took to going on his right instead, quite naturally, on the marked side, where a person has to be wanted to be let. And one evening on the terrace, he stopped short in the middle of a sentence about drainage and said, "Do you know what you do?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it is the side nobody stands on, and I am not nobody." They were married again the following June, in the same chapel with the doors open and the whole village in it, and a great deal of noise, which neither of them had asked for, and both of them remembered ever after as the best day of their lives. There was a building at Highmarch that had not been opened in 7 winters. It stands open now, at both ends, all summer. The frost still lies longest on that side of the yard, because the sun does not come round to it until nearly noon, but there are 40 horses under that roof again, and a lime tree on the path outside with the grass, grown back over where 2 people used to stand apart in the dark and wait for each other. And at first light, most mornings, before the household is up, a slim, upright woman with chestnut hair bound in a plain braid, in a mud-hemmed riding habit of dark green wool, comes out through the great doors beside her husband, who rides hatless now with the sun full on the marked side of his face, and does not trouble himself about it. And they turn north into the park, and go out together into the gold, on a grey horse, with a silver seam down his neck, and a bay beside him. And neither of them looks back at the doors at all, because there is no longer the least need to.